As Pamela and Isabel said, feel very free, and I do mean very free, to ask any questions along the way that you might like. I do well with heckling, so that works fine for me. So without further ado, what are we going to cover tonight? Well, the three main things I'm going to cover is a little bit around astrophotography and nightscape photography and what that means to me. I'm going to talk about planning. So a large amount of the time that I spend on my nightscapes is actually in the planning mode. So we'll do a little bit of a deep dive into that this evening. We'll talk about apps and the type of apps that I use and how I use them to go about getting the images that I want to take. And then finally, I personally tend to do in-person recce's, so we'll talk about that too. We'll talk about shooting. It tends to be the area most people want to know about is the numbers. So we will talk about the numbers, but also the types of different images you might want to take to be able to pull together a final image at the end of the day. What I won't be going into tonight is actually processing, because we could be here till midnight if I try and do that. My aim for the evening is very much to arm you with a little bit of information so that you can feel confident about going out and taking some images of your own. So, astro, nightscape, what does it mean to me? And perhaps more importantly, what does it not mean to me? So when I talk about astro, I'm not talking about deep space objects. I love and enjoy looking at them, but they're not the reason that I personally go out and take a nighttime shot. For me, it's actually all about the experience. I mean, that's why I go out. And I certainly mean a nightscape is pretty much a landscape, but just with a nighttime sky. I'm getting a bit older, not that I want to admit exactly how old I am, but I normally like to try and do an all-nighter. So effectively, to make the most of what the opportunities that are presented to me, then actually staying out all night, right the way through to a sunrise shot, can be one of the most beautiful experiences, almost quite zen-like. So the reasons for that is I find if I'm alone, the solitude sitting out underneath all of the night stars make you feel quite small and unimportant, and it puts all of your worries and the world into some kind of perspective. So when I go out, I'm definitely interested in finding a good landscape and experiencing all that that can offer me. So that's what I mean by astro. The types of nightscape. Now, these have actually evolved a lot for me. So I'll take you through some of that. But actually, I've been shooting nightscapes now for at least 7 or 8 years, probably more focused in that space in the last 3 or 4 years. But when I first started, I started out with the most commonplace nightscape you can imagine, which is Milky Way and stars. And that's what people mean when they say nightscape or astro, they're normally thinking about the Milky Way. But that's changed for me a lot. I think of late I've become more, I'd say almost, because it is only almost appreciative of a starry night image as much as a Milky Way, and all of the different things that we can get with that when it comes to clouds. So whilst I really appreciate the 2 images that I have here that are Milky Way shots, and I think, you know, they're absolutely beautiful. This one here actually is a good example of, I went and did a shot. This is Kilchurn Castle. I'm sure everyone recognises it. And I'd planned for it. I knew I wanted a star trail. I knew I wanted a time lapse. But this image is actually a pano of some test shots I did before I took a long exposure and then kicked my time lapse off. And the reason I enjoy this one is the colour in the sky, the light that's still there is really, really nice. But actually, there's also a little bit of a gotcha in here. The night I sat on this particular loch, having planned it so well, it was about 2 a.m. The composition I was planning for, it was sub-zero temperatures. So as I sat there taking my images, I could hear cracking. And effectively, the loch froze literally in front of my eyes. So this is the only image from the whole night that I have that has the reflected stars that I actually went out to try and shoot for, because the rest had a frozen a frozen foreground, which would not work for the composition. So I love that image, even though it doesn't have the Milky Way in it. But over the last few years, and when we get to talk about the planning, I'll be able to explain why. I've really started to embrace other modes of nightscape, and twilight and moonrise in particular. And in essence, the reason for that is it just gives you more opportunities to go out and shoot. I mean, if I take this image here, if you look really closely, there are stars, but this is a moonrise image. It almost looks like a daytime image because the brightness of the moon coming up behind the clouds here is such that it changes the feeling of it entirely. And you know, a few minutes later, the moon had risen above the clouds and it was all overexposed and whitewashed, so it was unusable. So this isn't an image I've used, I've not edited it, this is literally straight from camera. But it's a good example of a moonrise where you can get the equivalent of a nightscape, but almost with daytime light. This one here is actually one of my favourite images. So Pamela mentioned the success that I had in the 101 book for the International Landscape Photographer. And I didn't submit this for that panel of judges, but this is probably one of my favourite ones. And again, it's about the experience more than just the image, I think. So I set up this camera, setting a time lapse going, along with a friend of mine that was also shooting. And then I disappeared off with my second camera and spent all the time, care and attention on some stacked images, my composition, and I spent a whole evening doing it, but I kept coming back and checking this camera was working okay. And I'm lucky, I guess, unlucky for poor old Farah, but the friend that I was with actually was suffering from frostbite because it was so cold out in Canada the day before, and she'd been, I'll say unlucky enough, silly enough might have been the case, to decide to try and take her drone out. And to do so, she took her gloves off and she ended up getting frostbite in her fingers. And when she showed me her hands when we were stood in front of this lock and I could start seeing them go black, I went a bit mad at her. She got sent back to the car with strict instructions that if they were like that tomorrow, then we'd be taking her to the hospital. But she had the same camera as mine, and it was sat next to mine. So I kept making sure the settings for hers was okay, so that it kept shooting for her. So she actually has almost an exact replica of the images that I took. But actually, this time lapse, when I watched it back, has the reflected, or some of the reflected stars, which you can see. So all the care, love and attention I took on what I thought was going to be my still images, actually the one that I liked best was this one here. And I'll probably show the time lapse a little bit later on actually, but for me it's about, you know, about that experience. I'll take a moment to talk about judging. I hadn't intended to, but this image didn't do well for me in a competition recently. And they thought it should not have the foreground, it should all be about the sky. And that's kind of one of the things I do want to say to people is nightscape images are really easy to take, but you take them for yourself. You certainly don't take them for a judge, because what really matters to you is not going to be what someone else would look at it. So I love this image. It's one of my favorite ones, but it wouldn't do well in a competition. So twilight and moonrise. And the other thing about twilight and moonrise is I always thought I needed to take Milky Way shots in the darkest of deep night, so it was a black sky and the colours in the Milky Way would come out. But I've really come to enjoy the different qualities of the blue hues of astronomical twilight. And coming back to this one here yet again, that is a blend. We'll talk about it a bit more later, but that is a moonrise along with astronomical twilight. And the combination of the two is what gives you almost a sunrise or sunset quality, but with that kind of magenta hue in the sky. And I've just fallen in love with that concept. So that's the latest thing that I'm off chasing for, twilight and moonrise. And I can't talk about nightscapes without touching on aurora, especially given that here in Scotland, we're so lucky to be able to see it. In fact, we spoke before we started the presentation of being in lockdown and not being able to get out. And I wonder how many people on the call tonight were kicking themselves when the aurora alerts came through earlier this week. I certainly saw some amazing images coming from from Inverness and from Skye and all sorts of places. But I've generally gone aurora hunting in Iceland, and I've been 3 times now. So, you know, the interesting thing is you can be in Iceland, you can take images like this. Again, these aren't images that I've edited, they're just here for illustration purposes. But it could be raging so bright that actually you could be out all night just waiting and hoping for a cloud to just give you an opening to be able to see some of the pillars. And that's a lot of what I've seen in Iceland is amazing, writhing colours across the landscape, but you can't photograph them, but it's still an experience to be had. This one here, so this is a chap called Randy Hanna, who should know better than to get into other people's photos because he's a pro and a workshop leader over in America. But it's an example of the one time in Iceland we actually got some good aurora. And I think it probably lasted for about half an hour, so we were quite lucky that time. The people around me started to get quite upset at Randy because he was getting in their shots and, you know, ruining them. And my take would be, if you get a good image in front of you, find a way to incorporate it. So I just decided to make Randy part of my image. And again, this the dancing lights that you see with the northern lights are just, you know, a beauty to behold. But the best one, you know, the best aurora I've got is in Scotland. This was Torridon. A lot of people I'm sure will recognise it. I was out with some friends. We were trying to hunt some clear skies. We drove 3 or 4 hours for a gap in the clouds that was predicted on one of our weather apps. And when we got there and set up, which was actually over, that was looking slightly more northwest, we were shooting northeast, all of a sudden this cropped up, and knowing just what settings to use and how to swing around and take a picture meant we managed to capture this, or I certainly managed to capture this. It lasted for about 20-30 seconds and then it was gone. So to this day I'm quite proud to be able to say that actually my best aurora shot was taken in Scotland. Star trails. So I really enjoy taking star trails. And actually, you can take them with intent, or you can take them by leaving the lens open. So when you take a long exposure foreground, effectively, you're going to get a star trail. So my standard long exposure foreground is normally about 8 or 9 minutes. Not that I'd encourage people to do that, but that's what I tend to do for a foreground. And you get quite a nice star trail image out the back of that. I think we had Marcus McAdam on a couple of weeks ago on the EPS, and his personal preference for star trails is just to leave the lens open. Maybe not quite as long as an hour, but he would say, "Oh, just leave it open for 30 or 40 minutes." That comes with a health warning. So sensors in cameras are not designed to take an image that lasts that long, and I think it could invalidate your warranties. But I care more about the fact that you'd end up getting hot pixels. So I tend to take a lot of star trails now for reasons I'll come to when we talk about time lapses. But of these, my favorite is definitely my very first intentional star trail. So this is Joshua Tree. It's got the very distinctive trees there. And it was my first attempt. I tried to figure out how to find Polaris, how to get everything set up. I was breaking a lot of the rules. So a friend that I was with was telling me this image would not work because of the way in which I was taking it, but I was determined to try and get the patterns in there. But the thing with star trails is it's only when you put them together that you actually get to see what the final image looks like. So I was absolutely delighted with this. If I were to shoot it again, I would do a shorter exposure foreground so that I wouldn't have all of the movement of the smaller bushes. But yes, that's definitely one of my favorites. And this one here is taken almost in my mother's back garden. So where my mum lives, if you go out into the fields, there's actually this castle ruin. And I'd started a time lapse going to see if I could get a good star trail, and then disappeared off to take my stills of the Milky Way, which was not unsurprisingly in the opposite direction. And this one looks particularly colourful because I'd taken it with really short exposures, but a car came along. So the reason that the castle's actually looking so colourful and green is because that's the reflected colour of some car headlights. And then last, but by no means least, is time-lapse. So I definitely have become a fan of taking time lapses a lot more now. So we'll talk about my MO in a little while. But the benefit of taking a time lapse is that effectively you've almost got every option available to you. You've got a time lapse, you've got a star trail if you want it, you know, you've got a single exposure, and it gives you all of the opportunities without having to decide what one or another. So I spoke earlier about my twilight teaser, my favourite image that had that kind of twilight purple colour, and the fact that it was my second shooter camera that took it. So here's the example of what that time lapse looked like. And finally, just to touch on equipment. What equipment do you need? Not as much as you'd think. People tend to worry about having flash kit to take nightscapes. But I was saying earlier, it's one of the easiest images to take. The settings are so simple. You can take it with kit lenses. You don't have to have, you know, big expensive cameras. What you need is a device that's good at being light sensitive for low light conditions. There are even apps nowadays that people are taking some pretty darn good night photographs on. Lens wise, 2.f, 2.8 and wider is the recommended, but there's several that I will show you that I've taken tonight that was on an f4 lens because it's a landscape lens, not an astro lens. So actually almost any camera can take a great night shot. You do need a tripod though. That is the non-negotiable, unless someone has managed to find a different way of doing it, but you're generally going to be taking shots somewhere between 6 seconds and 30 seconds for a single image. And for that, you're going to need a tripod. So I tend to travel quite light when I go out at night time. I tend to take 2 bodies, 2 lenses. That's pretty much it, which compared to my landscape backpack, which is quite scary in how heavy it is, it's definitely a low kit requirement option. I've got some optional ones down here. So shutter, remote, and intervalometer. You can buy those, they plug in. A lot of the more modern cameras actually have them inbuilt. So when I did go to having a second body, I upgraded my Canon to be a 5D Mark IV, specifically because it had the inbuilt intervalometer, and I'd had external remotes and shutters fail on me a number of times, so that was the reason for moving. They're definitely optional because as long as you can take an image that's 30 seconds or less, you can get a single exposure without the need for any of those. And then obviously the fact that you would use them for above that is only if you're going to be doing time lapses, star trails, or a really extreme non-exposure foreground. And then I've popped Star Tracker in there because that polarizes opinions. I have friends that do nothing but tracked images, and they have some beautiful images. For me personally, I've tried both. I have a Star Tracker. I can show it to you later because people tend to be interested in seeing what it looks like. But my preference has definitely been to stack rather than track because I can do that from a time lapse. So equipment, dead easy. You could do it with whatever you've got. So planning. I mentioned we'd do a deep dive on this because generally I spend most of my time on the planning. 70, 20, 10. So 70% of my time is definitely spent on pre-planning. The 20 and 10 are fairly interchangeable between capture and processing. What I would say is if you are spending more time processing than you are capturing and or planning, then it's probably more digital art than nightscape or photography in my personal view. Either that or you didn't get it right in camera. It's always difficult not to get it right, but we'll cover more of that later. So why plan? Well, I tend to start really early with my planning. I start normally around Christmas time for the following year. I'll do some annual planning. And the reason I do that is quite simple. That when I started out, my nightscapes were Milky Way. They were Milky Way, which means in the UK, if you want the core of the Milky Way that's going to be above the horizon, it doesn't happen all that often. So you've got March, you've got April, you've got September, October, November. Those are the 5 months that you can normally get the core of the Milky Way showing above the horizon. Then if you want to make sure that you're taking it the best time of the month, which is new moon, for me, I'm not a professional landscape photographer. I make money from it, but I don't use it to pay my bills. So I do it at the weekend because I have a day job that pays my bill. So effectively for me, there's normally 5 pristine weekends in a year that I can do a Milky Way nightscape. That's not a lot. If you go away from the kind of UK, or you start thinking more broadly than just Milky Way, then you can shoot all year round. So this is why I started to get into all of the moonrises and everything else, is because I want as many opportunities as I can to go out and take photographs, because I want to be out under those skies. So moon planning, I keep banging on about new moon and moon cycles and things like that. Why do we talk about it? Well, the best time to take a nightscape if you're looking for Milky Way is going to be in the deepest of dark nights, which of course we don't have in the summer. So the deepest of dark nights with the brightest stars. And if the moon is up and it's more than a quarter full, then it bleaches out the sky. I've got quite an embarrassing story about taking a friend out. I promised I'd take him out and show him some nightscapes when I next did it. And I'd been planning to do a twilight combo. But the timing of the moonrise was such that I thought, well, if it doesn't quite work out, we can still get something. So we went out, we had to climb amongst this horrendous heather, this monstrous heather to get there. So it wasn't an easy night out. And it was just cloud bound. So, it didn't look like we were going to get anything. All of a sudden, the clouds lifted and we had this beautifully clear sky right where the Milky Way should be. And I wasn't there for Milky Way, but I had recce'd it anyway, so I knew it should be good. And because the moon was quite full, it was missing action. I was expecting it to be light, so not as prominent as normal, but this thing was MIA. So the poor chap that had come out with me, I think, was probably enjoying being able to learn how to take a good photograph, but I was so annoyed that there was no Milky Way there. So moon cycle is why people tend to say new moon, and it's not just because it's going to be faded, it may well not be there. So when you're planning, the other thing to think about is, how do I get more opportunities to take as many photos as possible? Well, actually, look at the moonrise and moon set. It may not be new moon, but the moon may not even be in the sky. It may have set hours ago, in which case you've got options. So that increases your options. The twilight combo we've mentioned. So when it comes to planning, it only happens 2 or 3 days in the month where you'll find that the moonrise or moon set aligns with astronomical twilight. So either an hour after moonrise or an hour before moon set. Those are the 2 times that if you get them right, you'll get those gorgeous tones we talked about. So moon planning allows me to go through my calendar and add those kind of dates in to optimize the options. However, just to make it more complicated, I quite often reduce the chances for myself, because my personal preference in landscapes tends to be abstract and quite often seascapes. So I tend to have to throw in a tide planning as well. So if you think it's difficult getting a clear night with the right moon, with the right Milky Way and the right tide, you've got even less chances. So maybe it's no big surprise that I have more landscapes than I do nightscapes. Compositional planning is something that surprises a lot of people, actually. And the first time I saw this, which was a number of years ago, it was news to me, and I had to go back and check some of my photos to check it out. Effectively, from March to May, the Milky Way, as most people know, will be in a southeasterly direction. But actually what was news to me was that it was quite horizontal. And when I looked back and looked at pictures, lo and behold, here's the April image, and it is quite horizontal compared to a September image, which is very much vertical. there's no getting away from the fact that that's a vertical image. So what that tells us from a planning point of view is in March, you want to be thinking about different locations where there'll be a good composition with a good foreground, looking into a southeasterly direction, and in particular, anything that's going to work with a horizontal composition. You get to the summer, and actually in the UK, it's almost a no-go zone. It doesn't matter where it's pointed, it doesn't matter what orientation it's at. We're not going to have a dark enough sky to be able to see much, so you won't see it, but that's where you get to play with all the other options. And then, like I say, July to November or October to November for us, you look in the southwesterly direction. So for those of us lucky enough to be living in Scotland, I would suggest in March or April, go to Dunnottar Castle. Beautiful location, perfect direction, and a great orientation of the Milky Way. And in October, November, and December, because it's mainly a tail of the Milky Way option, Glencoe Lochen is a great option. You can even do Millerochy Bay, although there's so much noise pollution. But start thinking about them and getting enough options so that whatever the weather, you can figure out which one's going to work for you. So that's compositional planning. Any questions so far? I'll take that as a no then. So you've done your annual planning. You've got your calendar up and running. You think you know where you want to go. You may even have some contingency plans. And the contingency plans are important because actually there's plenty of things in Scotland that can throw you off plan. Clouds is the obvious one. There is no point in trying to take a nice starry night sky image if you can't see them. In fact, a friend of mine was looking up the cloudiest, I'm trying to remember the cloudiest cities in the world, and Edinburgh came up as 10th. So we are the 10th cloudiest city in the world. So again, it's no surprise that we struggle. But other things to take into consideration can be things like wind. So why would wind matter? Well, actually reflections. One of the apps I use is Windy, and we'll talk about it later. I have alerts set up for certain areas where if there's X hours of it being no cloud and low wind, to send me an alert a week in advance because I might want a reflection shot. And that's kind of an obvious one. What was less obvious before I experienced it was actually that, where was I? I went to Glencoe, and the Glencoe region, we were talking about it earlier, is beautiful. Not particularly great for nightscapes. It doesn't line up with any of the kind of the real kick-ass images you might want to take. So I spent a couple of days there going around recceing, looking at every option, times of year, times of night, different compositions, so that I could go back if the, excuse the pun, stars aligned weather-wise for me. And go back. I went back, I think it was around my birthday. I took my youngest son with me, who comes out doing photography with me. And we were cloud-bound, despite the weather forecast saying we wouldn't be. But there was one night, I think it was about a 20-minute window of having no clouds. So we went out 2-3 o'clock in the morning. And when we tried to get out of the car, you couldn't stand up. It was literally so windy, there's no way you were going to be able to do a long exposure. So wind definitely does affect play. And then the third thing to say is there may be other unforeseen reasons why you can't go out and take photos, and not just the obvious of things like COVID. Last year, believe it or not, in March and April, several of my favourite long-awaited compositions that I wanted to do had absolutely perfect conditions, and of course we were in lockdown, so I couldn't go. But I have been stymied for other reasons as well, and it may be as simple as, there's works going on nearby, so there's lights that mean you can't take photographs. Or I've also been caught out with snow, the snow being so bad that the roads were closed. You cannot actually access the location that you wanted to go to. So contingency plans, and keep an eye on your near-term planning. Moving on to planning apps and tools, I use quite a few of these, and although they're mobile apps, I do still consider some of them desktop planning. If you only had one tool, one app, I would be recommending PhotoPills, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But some of the other ones I use, these are just screenshots of my mobile phone. I'm almost obsessed with Gaia. So this one in the middle, the little green thingy here, I was introduced to that out in Death Valley a couple of years ago. It's not a planning app. It's actually a tracking app for hikers that works without the need for GPS. So when I was out in Death Valley, one of the people introduced it to me so that we could find our way back. So she used it because she went out and recce'd and knew where she wanted to go, so she could make her way back to certain points. But there were several days, there were a group of as photographers out there where people were heading back to the hotel, and 2 hours later we were back having breakfast and they hadn't returned because they got lost. It can be that tricky. So Gaia for me has become a must-have, because when I go out and recce my areas, I want to be able to make sure I can make it back. And as importantly, do you know what? In the dark, I want to be able to get there too. So I want to be able to get there and get back, and Gaia does that for me. So if you've not come across it, it's worth having a look at it. Other things are obvious ones like moons. So Moon Plus I tend to use for my moon planning. You have a lot of that in PhotoPills, but Moon Plus is just so easy at being able to quickly see the best times of each month for my calendar. Weather, now that's a hot topic. Everyone has their favorite different weather apps. The two I use in particular are Weather Radar, which isn't an app, it's actually a website. It's a German one. I used to be able to say it had never let me down, but it did once in the Glencoe scenario. But by and large, that's the best one I've used. It's good for being able to see where there are windows in the clouds, so you can see early forecasts, and like I say, I use that a lot. I also use Windy. So this is the one that I set my alerts up in. Windy is quite complicated. Some people find it tricky to use, but it shows you different layers of clouds. It shows you the wind forecast. It's got 3 different satellites it uses, so you can check all of them to try and get a sound reading. But the one I probably use at the earliest stage is called Starcaster. Now, I've been beta testing this, I was going to say for 2 years, but I suspect it might actually have been launched now. So Starcaster almost pulls the details from a myriad of different sites, satellites, service engines, and you create the sites that you're interested in, but it's purely for night photography. So it gives you a really simple, really easy, and I'll show you a screen print of it in a while, view of what the chances, and it will give you a percentage chance of how good it's going to be. So Starcast has become my go-to app for weather for the coming week. If it isn't live on the App Store, go to their Facebook page, message them, and they'll send you a link if you're interested. But if you're just starting out Nightscapes, it's utterly excellent. It really does take all of the complications out of figuring out your weather. Other things in here, so Aurora Forecast is quite well known, and I get my alerts through there. I use my tide times. The only other one I'd probably mention is Investigator. So when you go out taking photos with your mobile phone, it has a GPS signal behind it. If you think that there might have potential for a nightscape, or even just to go back anyway, Investigator, and there are other apps, but this is the one that I use. If you put it in Investigator, it will give you the GPS, so you can find your way back to anywhere that you happen to have taken a photograph of. So they're probably the apps I use most. But like I say, if you only used one, for me, it would be PhotoPills. So PhotoPills, and this is just a small section of some of the things that it actually does. It can help you work out how long your exposure should be to make sure your stars are sharp. It can, what else? You can do from a desktop point of view, you can, if we look at this one here, you can see exactly the trajectory of a Milky Way, you move time, you can do all sorts of things. But the single most powerful one is this augmented reality. So you can stand on a location, hold your camera in front of you, put the night AR on, and literally just swipe left and right for time and see the composition that you're going to get at any given day. You can take screen prints of it. It takes the guesswork out of it. So it doesn't so much dumb it down, but it really means you maximize the opportunities. So I use this for all of my landscape as well as my nightscape, and I'm sure most people are well versed in it, but definitely have a play. And then here's just a couple of pictures to show you what a Starcaster looks like. So like I said, this is Port Knocky. So for bow fiddle, for example, this afternoon I had a quick look to see where in Scotland might be good, or certainly where in my preferred shooting locations might be good. It's not looking good. Most places are not going to be great for nightscapes, which is fine for me, seeing as I can't get out of Edinburgh. But if I could get out, I would be heading to bow fiddle, because tomorrow night about 5 o'clock, it's saying it's fair. And what fair means is it's going to be good and dark, so 100% darkness and 36% cloud. And I actually quite like a little bit of cloud when it comes to my time lapses, because it gives dynamism to it. So for me, I prefer Starcaster to tell me it's going to be an excellent chance if I'm going to drive any long distance, but actually it just gives a really good flavour in a really easy to understand manner. So my planning MO, just to try and pull it all together, and we'll talk about the Glencoe Lockwood one. So you do your desktop planning, do a physical recce, and the reason I like a physical recce really is understanding the terrain. We talked about Gaia, because once you're there, you can use photo pills to fine tune the composition. Yes, you can get 80% of the way there without even having to set foot on location. But as with all photography, the devil's in the details. So I do like to be able to go there and see it, touch it, feel it for myself. But I particularly like to do it for the tracking and Gaia, because whilst you might think it's nice and easy to be able to do, to get to where you want to take a photo at 2 a.m. in the pitch black with Scottish bogs and lakes and all sorts of things, it isn't easy and it can be quite dangerous. So safety first for me, Gaia, and understanding the terrain and seeing it with my own eyes during daylight means I can have full confidence that when I have got my backside out of bed on a cold, dark night, I'm actually going to have a good chance of getting the image I want to. You then go into your monitor cycle. So, yeah, I've mentioned enough already, I think, that the weather can stop play. I haven't quite had to cry, but there've been often enough times when I could feel like weeping when I've got excited about an image, but I can't go because the weather's not there. So you're in a lather, rinse, repeat cycle there. But it does happen. You do get to go outside. It can be a yippee function. And let's be honest, it may be easy to shoot nightscapes, but getting the clear nights is a difficulty. And if it was really easy to do everything, everyone would do it. So there's a real sense, at least for me, a sense of reward and elation when the plan actually does come together. And then you get to the stage where you get to capture it. So, and I think I've said time lapse plus stills, and hope nobody turns up to ruin your photos. Because if we talk about the Glencoe Locken example, I had gone and done a daytime recce. You know, I had worked out the optimum time, and I made sure that I had a September, an October, and a November date I wanted to go. I knew exactly the composition that I wanted. The final image I ended up with, I really like. It's not the true darkness I expected. The composition isn't perfect, but there's a reason for that. And if I show you the time lapse, you'll be able to see why. So for the eagle-eyed amongst you, you would have noticed that by the time the Milky Way was, you know, dead center for the composition that I wanted, actually the clouds had all but wiped it out. So in this instance, taking the time lapse worked brilliantly for me, because I had turned up at about 8:30 to start getting the time lapse going, and I had options. So this was the one time that my forecast app let me down because it told me it should be, cloud free all night. But my MO had managed to save the day. So I was delighted enough to have got an image that year, because I think that was 2019. Great. So we were on shooting, and this is the area that most people ask most questions. And I'll repeat as I try to try and hammer the message home that taking a night shot is actually dead easy if you go for a basic shot. We'll think about more than just the numbers, but let's talk about shooting because that's the interesting bit. But before we do, etiquette matters. So when I teach workshops for Nightscapes, one of the first things I do is I sit down and talk to people about etiquette. There's a fairly well-known set of rules, and they're fairly simple, but these two photos are probably a good example of the reason we need them. And they're quite simply, turn your lights off, let your eyes adjust, and ideally not use red lights to get to the place in which you want to take a photo, because quite often people think a red light isn't actually going to affect your photo. Well, you can see for yourself here, it absolutely does. So turn the lights off, let your eyes adjust, and then when you're on location, remember that if there are other people there, they will be completely open to you being there. Most people like and understand that other people have similar interests, and they may well be there for the same subject matter as you, which does mean you have to work together. So the main thing to know when you are on location is how to use your camera in the dark. So one of the tips I try to encourage people to try at home is how to really get to know your camera well and know the basic settings that you need at home. So at home, in a dark room, practice how to focus, how to magnify, how to check your image, and to change your settings. So if you can't do that, people are understanding as long as you ask. So the main rule is, if you have a need to turn your light on for any reason, just ask the people around you if anyone's shooting. And if you call out, is anyone open? They're sure as hell going to tell you if they are, because they don't want you spoiling their photo. And what you'll normally find is everyone will finish at the earliest opportunity and they'll let you know. So say there's 3 or 4 people there. The other 2 or 3 people are going to let you know as soon as they finish taking a photo, so that you can turn your light on, be as quick about it as you can, and then turn it off, and everyone's happy. I was giving this talk to another club, and someone commented, "Oh, it's just plain manners, isn't it?" It is, but actually, it works both ways. I was out going to shoot in a lavender field. The chap that I was with didn't want to go and take a photo because there were other photographers there, and I had to convince him, honestly, it's okay as long as you abide by the etiquette rules. Then everyone's happy to cooperate. But if you don't, these are the type of things that can happen, and they're not so nice. So stick to the rules, because if you don't, you'll ruin other people's photos, and you probably wouldn't be too happy if they did that to you. I think I may have mentioned in the Glencoe Locken one that I did, there were a couple, jolly nice couple, but there were a couple that decided that they were going to make their way to take a similar image, and it took them 20 minutes to walk the length of the loch all the time with their head torches pointing directly at me, which isn't the end of the world, but for my time lapse, it meant it ended up being half the length it would have been, and it had some choppy bits because I had to cut bits out where the light was affecting it. So please, etiquette matters. So techniques, single exposure, what type of techniques are there? Single exposure's the easiest, by far the easiest to take, to edit. It isn't a problem. Anything we do over and above a single exposure is a level of complexity you choose to add because you want a different result, but you don't have to. So multiple exposures, this is when it starts sounding complicated, but it really isn't, especially for normal landscape photographers. Blends, so I tend to do a lot of blends. What I mean by blends is where you take multiple images, but your tripod stays in the same place. So it's in the same position, the same sitting, and this, effectively you start and end anything you've taken within that period of time can be blended together, and that sits okay with my values. And the type of blends that I do is focus stacking. exposure blending, noise reduction, stacking, or tracking, and they can kind of be interchangeable for what you're trying to do. And I'll walk you through each of those. But like I say, you don't have to do any of those. What I don't do is composites. I can appreciate composites. I don't do them. It's not my style. It's not my personal preference. And the only difference really between a composite and a blend is quite often the tripod's moved. So it's a different time, different day, different location. So the age-old adage of someone putting a unicorn in because they've taken a sky and they use it in every different location because it's so great, that's fine. That's art. Me, I like doing blends. So these are the techniques that I'll talk you through. Settings, so what are the numbers? Actually, before I talk about settings, I'm going to talk about focus. So it's the one bit that people struggle with most. And for me, it's actually one of the easiest bits other than the basic settings, once you know how to go about it. And there's three obvious ways to think about focusing. The first is pre-focus. So high risk, in my opinion, but I know some people that will take their camera and will go out in daylight, focus on infinity, which is pretty much just something a long way away, so a mountain, something further away. They may even tape their lens, so then they'll go out in the evening and they'll know it's set correctly. Actually, what I'd encourage instead is get to know where your infinity point is, because for most lenses, the exception to that tends to be prime lenses. I've got 2 prime lenses that actually work perfectly. Infinity is infinity. But for most others, it's normally infinity and back a bit. And you need to play in daytime to know where that is and what that looks like. But you can pre-focus. Risky, but doable. My preferred option is live view. So I'll get to location. I'll make sure my lens is on manual. Some people use auto depending on how much ambient light there is around. But if you do use auto, make sure you switch it on to manual before you start shooting. The last thing you want is your camera starting to hunt, especially if you're doing a time lapse. And then all you do is in live view, go into the deepest magnification you can. I start in the top right, everyone's different. And you literally just move your live view focus point in that deepest along the top of the screen. If you don't see a star, you go down one and then you come back. And it's almost like a game of, I won't quite say Pac-Man, but that kind of Snake, the old mobile. And you just keep moving. And normally within the first 2 or 3 passes of going across your screen, you're going to find a star, and then you can fine tune your focus. You'll have started at near enough infinity because you'll know where that is, and then you'll just fine tune it. So live view is my preference, and generally I found it pretty much idiot proof, except for the one time I forgot to take my camera cap off, lens cap off, and I could not work out for the life of me why I couldn't find a star. But there you go, maybe not idiot proof completely. But the third and final option, which is a final resort, is if you've tried those and you know that your image isn't coming up sharp, check nobody else, if there are other people there, are taking photos, and then use a spotlight, your phone, your head torch, and light something up in the distance, whether it's a tree, something that you can focus on. So that's a final resort. It may spoil your night vision, so bear that in mind. But generally, those are the 3 options for focusing. And once you've got that nailed, everything else is easy. So settings, right? If I would say it was as easy as ISO 3200, 15 to 20 seconds, let's say 20 seconds, to make it easy, f2.8, you've got a single image. And that is generally my go-to starting point. It's as simple as that. The aperture, as fast as your lens is capable of, f2.8 as we said, but f4 is fine, whatever you have. Shutter is open as long as you can without star trails. For most people, 15 or 20 seconds is perfect. Wide angle, a lot of people would say 30 seconds. But you can use photo pills to check out for your camera and your lens, what does it think the exposure time should be. But rule of thumb, 15 seconds and you'll be fine. And then the third part of that triangle is ISO. So as low as possible, and still able to get enough light into your image to get a single image. If you're doing stacking, which we'll talk about in a minute, then that's different. But generally, most people will say 3200 or 6400. So 6400 is a fairly fail-safe, but I find it's a bit blunt and can take too much light in. 3200 is my go-to. So there you go. If you do have a pen and paper, someone said earlier, ISO 3200, 15 seconds, f2.8, magic, done. Now, other single exposures. So again, we talked about Aurora. So Aurora is pretty much the same as any other night sky, except that it can be a great deal brighter, which means it doesn't need to be either as long or as high in ISO. So for these images here, the Iceland one, as I say, is just for example purposes. That was f2.8, 6 seconds, and ISO 1600, because it was that bright. You really didn't need to be long or a high ISO. The Scottish one down here, that was ISO 3200, f2.8, and I just dialed it down to 13 seconds. So it wasn't as bright or as vibrant, but obviously it still managed to get the pillars and the colours. I probably could have gone a shorter exposure time, but I liked the movement that you got in there. So those are those. So more time consuming, especially when it comes to post-processing, is the blended shot. So the simplest blended shot is an example I've got here. It's focus stacked. Effectively, the two type of simple ones are focus stacking or exposure blending. In this instance, I only needed to focus stack. This image, I was at Jigsaw Rocks. I went there to do a sunrise. To the question I just had, I did decide to get there the day before I wanted to take the shot and spend a day or two there. So I might as well go and play and do some nightscapes. I could find out what compositions I liked. I could just have a little bit of fun. So in this instance, it's a blended shot between a blue hour shot and the night sky. Exactly the same exposure settings though. So this was ISO 3200, f2.8 and 20 seconds. The reason I stuck to 20 seconds from memory was I just liked the milky quality it gave the water, so it simplified the image. So I was able to keep exactly the same settings in blue hour and then when darkness came along. Exposure blending, when it comes to it, the other reasons you might need to do that is you might just have some bright things going on. You might have light pollution, you might be doing some light painting, or of course you might have the long exposure foreground that I mentioned. So focus stacking and exposure blending are the most common and simple blended shots. Then you get to the other couple of multiple exposure blends, which are stacking and tracking. So stacking, what do I mean by that? So all stacking really means is you're going to take a whole bunch of images and then you're going to use some software to overlay them on one another to give you the equivalent of a longer exposure. What that means is you can have it at a much, much higher ISO and a shorter exposure period, which means your stars will be pin sharp. So if you wanted to print this up big, you would want to make sure those stars had no coma on them whatsoever. You wanted them to be pin sharp, so you might stack. And I do this a lot now. So photopills again can tell you what shutter speed you want to do, and you just need to take a number anywhere between 7 and 20. I've seen some people say 15 or more, and it's not adding any value. I've had situations where I do either. I normally just take 20 and use Starry Landscape Stacker to stack the images. In this image here, I spoke earlier about my Twilight teaser and the fact that my final image came from the time lapse. Well, this is what the camera I was babysitting took. And the reason I wanted to use this as an example is so you can see, for example, you can't see the stars reflected in the foreground, but you can see really, really sharp, sharp stars. The downside of stacking is that it really does treat it like a long exposure. So effectively, the clouds here are like a long exposure. So you can lose some of the stars because once it's been covered by a cloud and you stack it together and blend it, you're going to get that long exposure feeling. So, you know, it's horses for courses, but it does help you get a buttery smooth finish on the stars for sure. So that's stacking. And conversely, tracking. This is the first time I ever used my star tracker. And I got really excited. So the concept of a tracker is pretty much, and I think I've got a picture of it down here for people that want to know what it looks like. You can get a star tracker that tracks the Earth's rotation. You fix it to your tripod, you make sure it's aligned with Polaris, so the North Star, so that it can rotate, and then you put your camera on top of it and you take a long exposure. So effectively, this image was a 2-minute image for the sky. It's a blended shot, so it's a blue hour foreground blended with a 2-minute long exposure at f2.8, an ISO 1600, whereas the blue hour was, I think, 6 seconds, an ISO 400, because I really wanted the detail of the crystals. But the sky is barely edited. It's got barely any processing, because when you look at that, well, for me, certainly, you take the shot and it coming up on the back of the camera after it's taken the image, assuming it's aligned properly, and all of these colors, the pinks, the nebula colors that people add in their processing because they want to try and get them, it's all there and it's real, and you've got it in one single image. The thing to remember is it is following the Earth's rotation, so you have to blend it, because effectively your foreground's going to be blurred when you take a tracked shot. So you're going to have to blend it with a foreground shot. But that's the concept of tracker. As I said, I now, having tried both, tend to do stacking rather than tracking, because the downside is it takes a while to set up. It takes a while to take a 2-minute image. And actually, in the time I do all of that, I could have taken at least 20 images that I can track and have a star trail and have a time lapse. So for me personally, and have a lighter bag, kit bag. So I like the result. I like the convenience of going for stacking. Any questions on those before I just go through some of the images that I've got?
Can I ask, can you hear me, Vikki?
I can, yes.
Is there a particular setting on the camera for time lapse? I don't think I have that. Maybe I've not found it.
Well, there are some cameras that do time lapse literally in camera and can put it all together. All it really is a set of exposures. So when I first taught my son to do it on my old Nikon, you could just turn the shutter on to constant and it would just take image after image.
All right.
On average, a time lapse tends to be an hour. So if I take an hour's time lapse, that's normally quite a good view of what I would need. But no, it's not. It's just a series. It's just sitting there and taking picture after picture. And then I bring it together either with Photoshop or other software.
Could I do that with setting the camera on a tripod and using the remote control on a frequent basis?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. So that's where the intervalometer comes in. So the intervalometer is literally just an external shutter remote. Forgive me if I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but you can just set it to say, I want it to go every 5 seconds or every second.
Right.
So it will choose the interval between which those images are being taken.
Yeah, and they don't have to be equal the times, or do they?
It's best to, because otherwise it will look staggery.
Right,
so obviously you want a smooth feeling of what's going on with the sky.
Right.
But it's helped me embrace clouds. So it used to be that clouds were the pain because they get in the way of the sky. But actually, if you do a time lapse and you just see, I don't know, a Milky Way or stars moving, it's far more compelling if it's got some clouds in there. So no, I absolutely love time lapses, daytime and nighttime, but nighttime in particular.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so what I thought I would do is just take you through, we were talking about, for me, it's about the experience. So I'll firstly show you a time lapse. Let me get this one going. And I think this could be, I think it could be egg. So I was in egg recently, and the issue I had here was I forgot to put my lens warmer on, and we got condensation. So the reason this is a fail for me is you can just see the Milky Way starting to come into shot, and all of a sudden the whole thing is faded out because my lens had condensation. Bear with me. My lens had condensation, but my camera continued shooting for another hour, at which point the Milky Way would have been perfectly aligned. It had been quite a high tide, so I was, lacking choices for what to do there. But actually that might be a fail. However, the experience, and I had two cameras going, so I had other options as well, is such that I don't see it as a fail. The Kilchurn Castle one that I mentioned, because you couldn't really take much of the foreground reflected looks, I had to experiment, and sometimes that in and of itself can be quite nice. So this was taken with my 50mm lens, which I'd never used for astro, but I happened to have it on me. So I ended up starting to think about what would a closer view look like. So so in terms of having a crop sensor, this is the kind of thing that you might find that you're getting. And I really quite enjoy that. Other fails, or well, this one's quite funny. So this is, I talked about if you do a long exposure foreground, how you get a bit of a star trail. I wasn't going for star trail, I was just going for the long exposure foreground, until some lovely person decided to drive their car down, and this was the Devil's Causeway, and ruin my entire 8-minute shot with the headlights. So so I didn't get an exposure blended image on that one. What other stories? Okay, so this was my intervalometer story. So this was Joshua Tree National Park. I was out shooting with a friend of mine. We had spent ages setting up this this tent because he wanted a picture of a star trail with an illuminated tent in the front. We started it all going, can't remember what time in the morning it was, but in Joshua Tree you have rattlesnakes, the coyotes were howling. It was actually quite a scary environment to be in. So we went and sat in the car for the hour it would take for the star trail to go. And this was the final straw for me that meant I went and bought my 5D Mark IV with inbuilt intervalometer, because it took 10 images and then it quit on me. So by the time I went back and looked, Joe had a wonderful array of hundreds and hundreds of images, and I didn't. So that's a reminder of that evening. But the next night, this was one of the images that I took, the one on the right hand side here. And the fail here wasn't for me, it was for Joe, but luckily enough, he'd been careful enough. So we were out in different parts of the park. We had walkie-talkies because it is a slightly dangerous place to be. We had walkie-talkies, and I'd gone back to the car, and I'd got the shot, I'd got a number of shots, and I was in the car having a bit of a nap when the walkie-talkie squawked at me, and I suddenly heard, "Vikki, can you flash the headlights? I'm lost. I can't find my way back." It's so dark that he couldn't find his way back. Again, it's why I like things like Gaia, so I'm never going to be in that situation, hopefully. And when I flashed the lights, he was literally no more than 40 seconds worth of paces away, but he had got completely lost. So be careful when you're out there. This one here, so this was the same day as we took the condensation, and I still like it nonetheless. And that was in the peak of the meteor shower. So that's one of my most memorable nights ever doing Nightscape. My mother was with me, and she's on here, so she'll be able to confirm. You could lay on the ground, and the meteors were going off. Literally, I'm going to say, I think it said it's something like 140 a minute, but they were constantly going. I've never seen anything like it. This was when I just turned up too late, so planning fail. You know, I knew I wanted to take some pictures here, but the Milky Way was just disappearing, so I had to go and find some contingency options. And then this last one, so this wasn't so much a fail, but I spent hours trying to find a foreground set of patterns because I like abstract stuff. And sometimes it just doesn't quite work. So whilst this is a tracked shot, I like the sky, the foreground is just way too cluttered. But it was my third or fourth night on the trot of shooting nightscapes. Other people had been out with me on day 1 or 2 when we were shooting all day. So effectively, I just sat there and watched the sunrise and skipped out on the sunrise shoot for the rest of the group. And it was the most amazing experience. But I don't have a shot that I would necessarily use. We've done that. And then the only other thing I wanted to end on was it may have been lockdown. And these are all legal and above board, but these are some of the nightscapes that I've managed to take in 2020. So we have the meteor showers at the Kelpies. That was quite tricky. That's a blended shot to try and get rid of some of the noise reduction of the evenings. But that was quite a nice evening. Comet Neowise. So that's the best shot I got of Comet Neowise. It may be lucky, but it'll come up on your screen soon. But my favourite shot of that night was the time lapse I had going in the opposite direction. So I took a time lapse at the Scottish lavender fields, and it was only in watching the time lapse back, and this is the unedited version, but effectively there was suddenly a moment where the clouds had formed this like candy floss ball. So I decided to actually process that rather than the Milky Way shots that I tried to do. And I think it was probably just after that, the next week, Eamon, I think you came with me when I went back to have another go, but it wasn't playing ball, was it? Egg. I've never taken a black and white nightscape before, but Egg is no normal beach, I would think it's fair to say. So the bay is beautiful. So that's possibly one of my favourite images of the year. And then this one's a work in progress. So I talked about the meteors. This is me about a quarter of the way through processing the number of meteors that were shooting across the sky. So I've yet to finish that and edit it properly, and I'll probably end up having to take a whole load of meteors out because it'll just look way too cluttered. But that again was a bit of a first for me.
Was that the Perseids meteor shower, Vikki?
Was it Perseids? Was that in the one in December? I think Perseids might have been the one that I've got here on the Kelpies. I'm trying to. It's the Geminids. I think this one was. So this was the one earlier in December.
Yeah. And where were you?
That was in the Isle of Egg. And like I say, I've never experienced anything like it. The sky was just alive with shooting stars. And as I say, all of this was taken legally. I didn't break any rules. They're either when they were, we didn't have quite such strict restrictions. But I managed to get out and get some nightscapes in 2020. So I consider myself blessed. And that was it for me. So unless there are any more questions.